I'll start recording. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Happy Tuesday. My name is Jorge Acosta Palmer, and I'm the director of the Statewide Training Initiative. Thank you for joining us here today for mindfulness as a tool for well-being. I want to make sure that the people that are waiting in the waiting room are admitted, so sorry for the distractions. Let's see if we have people waiting. I think we're good. So I will continue with the training presentation. So, okay, before I introduce our speaker, I do want to go through some quick housekeeping announcements. This training is being recorded. You're going to receive a copy of this recording and an email from Zoom. It's not going to come from me. It's going to come from Zoom within 24 hours. If you don't see that email, no worries. I'm going to drop my email in the chat as well. You can reach out to me and I'll make sure you have access to those, to the recording and the materials. This training is approved by CLE, by the Florida Bar for CLE. It's 1.5 general credits and 1.5 mental health and wellness credits. So I'll announce the CLE code towards the end of the presentation. I'll drop it in the chat as well. And I will also include all this information in the automatic email that will go out to you within 24 hours. Closed captions are enabled for anybody who needs them. If you're having any issues with accessibility or the captions, you can reach out to me directly and I'll make sure you're set up. This training is being co-hosted by the Public Interest Law section, otherwise known as PILS. If you're not familiar with PILS, I'll encourage you to visit their website and take a peek. It is a pretty cool section. There's a lot of benefits from joining, a lot of opportunities to network and learn from the experts. I'll drop the link to their website into the chat as well. And final piece of housekeeping announcements. One thing that is a little bit different today is that we're doing a meeting format. So you will see all of your boxes in there. You're gonna be able to raise your hand and ask questions during the training. You can drop questions into the chat as well. If you have a great question, but you don't wanna, you wanna do it anonymously, you can also send me a private message on the chat and I'll just ask it on your behalf without naming you. So yeah, you look forward to your participation. Make sure to raise your hand or you can even come off mute if you wanna come ask a question to, for our speaker today. And without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Julia Wilson. Julia Wilson is a leadership coach and consultant specializing in nonprofit management and board governance, focusing on nonprofits and civil legal aid services, civil rights, and advocacy. With over 20 years of leadership experience, she has served as the executive director of the John Paul Stevens Foundation, One Justice, and the Legal Aid Association of California. Julia holds multiple coaching certifications and a certificate in nonprofit board governance consulting through BoardSource. Her board work draws on frameworks like governance as leadership and BoardSource's purpose-driven board leadership, as well as one of my favorites, the ABA standards for the provision of civil legal aid and the Legal Services Corporation performance criteria. Must read if you're a civil legal aid attorney. She integrates expertise in nonprofit funding, governance, and mindfulness with a commitment to equity, inclusion, and racial justice. Julia has served as both CEO and board member of National Nonprofit and is the immediate past chair of the BoardSource Board of Directors. Without further ado, I'm pleased to pass it over to Julia. Julia, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you so much, Jorge. That's my least favorite part of every training. Thank you for that very kind introduction. And thank you so much to all of you for the opportunity to be here and be a part of your day. Before I get into what we're going to do today and an overview of the content, I first want to offer just a moment of transition. So this is just an invitation to try to let go of what happened right before you hit the Zoom login link, and perhaps try to set aside what might be coming later in your day and just take a breath, or sort of look around the space where you are, or do whatever it is that settles you into this moment right now where we are. And just sort of like try to bring down the sense of the pace of the day in whatever way supports you. A way that you might think about doing that is to call to mind the things that come up for you in response to these prompts, which are considered resiliency prompts in the trauma-informed and resiliency-informed areas. So think about something who's helping you right now, or someone or something that gives you a sense of strength, or someone or something that has helped you get through complicated times in the past. And this can be a person who is alive or imaginary or historical or has passed away. It can be a pet or a place or a thing or a memory. Whatever it is that gives you a sense of comfort and strength or joy, and really call that to mind. Like, bring it into your mind's eye. For me, it is my grandmother. She was someone who gave me unconditional love and a sense of deep belonging, both to myself and with her. And even though she's no longer here now, I can feel that she kind of fills me up to think about her. And so just bring something to mind that gives you that sense. And then just check in and see if you can notice what that does to your own nervous system. Are there any sensations inside of you? Like, when I think about her, I can tell I get kind of a sense of ease in my chest. There's something warm in my heart space that opens up, but there's also a tinge of something, a little something in my throat around the fact that I miss her still. And both of those things are there. And if you check in and notice what that's doing to your nervous system, you can just start to categorize, like, are those sensations, those feelings inside your own body, are they pleasant or unpleasant or neutral? Neither of those two things. And so as you do that, what you're doing is you're both transitioning to be here right now. You're also resourcing yourself with something, with that thing that you're thinking about. And you're also reading your own nervous system. So even if that's all you get out of today, that's it. We've just done mindfulness. You can check the box. But so what are we going to do with more detail today? We're going to talk about mindfulness, both what it is and how it connects to our well-being. We're going to talk a little bit about the biology of the human response to stress, because wow, there's a lot of stress just in being a human being, and also in this moment in time where we are right now. There are many stress points. And then we're going to actually take 20, 25 minutes at the end and try out a different set of mindfulness practices, right? Because mindfulness is a thing, it's also a practice. So we're going to try out some different things, and you can just experiment with them and see which ones are and are not the right match for you. Okay, so we've done a bit of mindfulness, a little bit more about like what it is. So, I thought about having a moment here where we actually talked about what are the stresses of being a legal services lawyer, but I know that you all know those, like you live those every day. We probably don't need to do a big brainstorming thing. So if you just think about your life, there are, challenges and complicated things and things that are stressful that you're navigating, right? That's kind of a given. And the connection here between those stresses, which we'll talk more about the biology of sort of what's going on inside of us when we're experiencing stress or challenge. The reality is that we actually navigate most of our life on a kind of autopilot. The brain has to work so hard to process information and do things like thinking that it has to put whole chunks of our life in the habit space or the unconscious mind. And so we actually spend most of the day on a kind of autopilot, almost like we're sort of moving through our day without being fully conscious of the thing that we're doing as we're doing it. And that has actually been shown to not support our well-being. Even though it's the way that we have to navigate life for the brain to do what it needs to do, it actually doesn't serve our overall well-being. So the connection here is that we try to move from that kind of autopilot to more increased awareness, becoming more aware of our experience in a conscious way. And as we grow our capacity to be more aware, the thing that allows us to do is move into a place where we regulate ourselves on purpose. And when we do that, we are more able to navigate stress and challenge, not at the mercy of our sort of unconscious, habitual, sometimes worry and stress patterns, but to make choices in the moment where we are about how we want to navigate. And that has been shown to increase our well-being. So the goal is not to get rid of stress, because that's impossible, but the goal is to increase our muscles, basically our mind's muscles and our nervous system's ability to navigate stress and challenge when we encounter it. So that's the big picture goal. The definition of mindfulness that I use, which comes from the practice of mindfulness-based stress reduction, which is the non-faith-based version of mindfulness that actually comes out of the medical system and is data and research informed, is just this. Mindfulness is a way of paying attention. That's all it really is like choosing to pay attention on purpose to the moment where you are living right now, right? Which is the only moment where life is actually happening, is like where we are right now. So paying attention on purpose to the moment where you are and your own experience. And this last bit is super important, with an attitude, a mindset of kindness to ourselves and a kind of curiosity and openness and expansiveness about our own experience. So if all you do is pay attention to your life right now where you are living, and you do that not with the inner critic, which we all have, that sort of harsh inner monologue, which society trains us to use, but instead with a kind of kindness towards yourself, a warmth to your own experience, that's mindfulness, if you can come back to that. So that's the definition we'll be using today. So here are some things that mindfulness is not. And I get this all the time when I talk about being a mindfulness instructor. People are like, oh, I can't do that. I can't make my mind be quiet. That is not what mindfulness is. And people are right. You cannot actually make your mind be quiet. Your mind is designed to think lots and lots and lots and lots of thoughts. And it will do that 24 hours a day if you allow it, right? It will wake you up at 2 o'clock in the morning and think lots of thoughts. It will drag you around and think lots of thoughts, some of which are useful to you, many of which are not useful to your own well-being. So the goal of mindfulness is not to turn your mind off, but it is to train your mind and sort of take more gentle control of it so that it's not whiplashing you around. Mindfulness is also not about Zen state, like blissfulness. It is true that sometimes when you become mindful, when you pay attention in that way in the current moment, you can feel calmer. But sometimes what you're paying attention to is not calm, right? It is actually, there is something dysregulating or stressful going on. So sometimes folks will say, well, I can't get to that blissful state. I must not be doing it right. But it is paying attention even when something is stressful in order to be able to navigate it more intentionally and not be whipped around by our brain's own response. So if these are the things that mindfulness is not, here is what mindfulness is. It is being self-aware by paying attention in that way. It is being curious about your own experience in the moment. It is about the ability to respond to things, like that navigation, that choice, instead of reacting as things come at you. And it is also about being able to connect more deeply with ourselves in the moment where we are, and also with the people that we care about. So what it is, what it's not. People often say to me, like, I can't imagine sitting and like being quiet and still for 10, 20, 30, 40 hours on end. And what this does is it actually takes the thing of mindfulness, which is what we want, which is what increases our well-being, and it's conflating it with meditation, which is a kind of practice that gets us to more mindfulness. So mindfulness meditation is often done in a sitting posture for longer periods of time. But what I say to folks is like meditation, mindfulness meditation, the act of meditating is like going to the gym and doing a very specific kind of exercise. And if it's not the right exercise for you, like I don't really like lifting weights. So when I go to the gym, I'm not going to lift weights. I'm going to be on the spin bike. Well, mindfulness meditation is like lifting weights. If it doesn't work for you, you don't have to do it. And increasingly, what the research is showing is people don't have to do long periods of mindfulness to get the same benefits, but they do have to do it consistently, just like going to the gym. So if I go to the gym and I'm on the spin bike for 5 minutes a day, I will still show benefit. But if I go once a month for 30 minutes, I'm actually not going to get as much benefit from it. Mindfulness is the same thing. So we are going to do a 10-minute meditation practice at the end of today. Well, I'm shooting for about 10 minutes. We'll see how much time there is. But I'm going to walk you through a bunch of other micro practices that take like 30 seconds. Those are just as good for your well-being. We're going to do some neuroscience and biology, but just to kick things off, like what is going on in the brain as we go through the day and when we become more mindful. And there are two networks in the brain that operate like on-off switches. You can't be in both of these networks at the same time. Your brain is either in one or in the other. And the first one you're probably familiar with. It's what's called the active task network. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It's any time that your brain is focusing on doing a thing. So if you're reading or you're writing an email and you're super focused on that thing that you're doing, or you're cooking dinner or you're brushing your teeth and you are paying attention to the thing that you are doing while you are doing it, then your brain is in the active task network. The other network, the flip side, the other side of the switch, is called the default mode network. And this is where your brain is wandering. You're daydreaming. Your brain is wandering around. It's actually not paying attention to the thing that you're doing at the moment. And so this happens sometimes like when you're driving, right? And like you know the route that you're driving, so your brain doesn't have to pay attention. Like if you don't know where you're going, your brain is definitely an active task network because it has to figure out where to go. It's paying attention to driving as you're driving. But if it's a route that you drive all the time, the brain goes, oh, I can put this in the unconscious. I've got a habit loop around how to drive this. I'm going to think about the other things. I'm going to think about the hearing I've got in 2 days. I'm going to think about that interaction with my supervisor or coworker, and the mind wanders around. Now, there's lots of benefits to the default mode network. It's often where the brain like puts together creative, unexpected solutions to a problem. You know, that moment in the shower when your brain's been kind of running on in background on something, and you're like, oh my gosh, that's what I should do about that thing. Your brain's in default mode network, and it's made an unexpected connection. The problem is that most of the time when our mind wanders around, it wanders around about us, because our brain likes to think about us. It's part of being a human. And most of the time when it's thinking about us in this wandering around, it's actually thinking about us negatively. It's ruminating on something that we did in the past, or it's worrying about something that is coming up in the future and kind of rehearsing for that thing over and over again. And all of the research shows that when we're in the default mode network, wandering around like this, thinking about ourselves negatively, it undercuts our own well-being. It's related to stress and worry and even anxiety. So when we meditate, we are putting the brain in active task network on purpose. We are telling the brain, focus on this thing, stop wandering around. So I'll come back to that, but hang on to that concept. So if you think about the brain like a flashlight, and actually if you think about the attention of the brain, right? Because the brain pays attention to things. You can use the metaphor or the image of the brain's attention being like a flashlight. And if most of the time the flashlight is kind of moving around and on its own and highlighting different things, especially in the default mode network, it's like, oh, my kids thing over here, I have to remember to do that. Oh, I almost forgot to do that. Oh, here's this thing I have coming up. You know, I have to go testify in front of the legislature and I'm worried about that. So my brain's going to, flashlight's going to spend some time on that. Meditation is like, or mindfulness, sorry, is like gently taking a hold of your own attention flashlight and gently, gently training it to point on the things that you want to in order to reduce your sense of stress and worry as you navigate things. So that's what we're going to be doing today. The benefits of mindfulness, and there are increasingly all kinds of research studies happening in the contemplative space showing the neuroscience of what mindfulness does. I'll just highlight a couple of these, all of which I think are actually super important as practicing attorneys. I wish I had known some of this stuff when I was actively practicing. There's a bunch of emotional benefits, which are really connected to well-being. So bringing down stress levels, increasing that sense of resilience, meaning your ability to navigate the stresses of life as they come at you, your ability to regulate and sense and modulate your own emotions. There's all kinds of stuff that actually works in the brain around strengthening your ability to focus on things, increasing memory, reducing bias by creating more of a ability to recognize and have a moment where you can respond to bias instead of reacting out of bias. There's a bunch of physical health benefits to mindfulness, and then all kinds of behavioral stuff. You can get better sleep. You can actually be a better listener and communicator when you're practicing mindfulness. And for lawyers, when we're facing complex ethical considerations in the practice of law, which come up all the time, our brain is more able at both a cognitive level and a behavioral level to assess those ethical challenges and make well-regulated, sound decisions in the attorney space. Okay. So how do we learn to read our own nervous systems and when we might actually need to practice some mindfulness? So to give some framework here, I'm gonna introduce a framework that was created by the Trauma Resource Institute. They work to train therapists in this, and they also have a community health model called the community resiliency model, where people teach peer-to-peer, biology-based, mindful well-being skills. So I'm going to give you a little bit of their framework today. And it's a way of learning to read our own nervous system, which increases our awareness and supports us in knowing when we need to become more mindful. Okay, so the basic idea is this. Every human being, based on our biology, has something called the resilient zone. And in some frameworks, it's called the window of tolerance, meaning how much stress can we tolerate. But I like resilient zone better because it has a strengths focus first. And the basic idea is this. When we're operating in our resilient zone, we can navigate the stresses of life and feel that we are able to do so from the best parts of ourselves. So as challenges come at us, we don't get so overwhelmed by them that we revert to the swampier or less, the parts of ourselves that we might be less proud of or that are less skillful in meeting those challenges. And you probably, if you think about it, you have a sense of like, what is it like to be in your own resilient zone? And as we go through each day, within the zone, staying in that place where we can navigate life from a place of capacity, we kind of go up and down. And this is almost like our battery level or our energy level inside the zone. So just to give you an example, I woke up this morning feeling pretty well rested, right, which is part of like resourcing ourselves. And I could tell that I was feeling pretty good. Like I was able to like get up and feel like, yep, I can meet this day. So I was probably somewhere right in the middle of my resiliency zone. And then I had some coffee, which put me up in my energy level, right? Battery went up a little bit. I'm closer to the top of my resilient zone, still feeling totally capable, not over caffeinated, not feeling anxious, but you know, more energized. And then I did some yoga and could feel my energy level kind of drop back down to the middle or maybe a little bit lower. Energy dropped a little bit, right? Feeling pretty calm and even maybe a little sleepy during the yoga. And then I remembered that I was doing this training together. I needed to get some of the materials together and it went right back up. High energy, a little bit of worry or stress involved. right? But this gentle up and down is happening all throughout our day. Like we feel a little sluggish in the afternoon. We get up and take a walk and feel a little adjusted. This is what your nervous system is doing below your conscious awareness all day long. Now, this is not a happy zone. Some people think resilient means you feel like only happy emotions. That's not true. You can feel all of the emotions in this zone, meaning you can feel super energized, hopeful, excited. You can also feel super energized, angry, irritated, right? Those both sit at the high energy level, just different emotions, emotional sensations. You can be closer to the bottom of your own resilient zone and feel sluggish and tired and a little blue, like a little sad. You can also be closer to the bottom of your own resilient zone and just feel chilled out, relaxed, calm, lower energy, different feelings, right? And still up and down all day long, up and down in our resilient zones. So if you take a moment now, the invitation would be, like if we were in a room together and I could put the zone up on a wall and you each had a sticky note with your name on it. And if you check in with yourself and say, where am I in my own resilient zone right now? Am I more energized, closer to the top? Am I neutral, somewhere in the middle? Or am I feeling a little lower energy right at this moment? A little more sluggish, a little sort of lower battery? Where would you gauge your own energy level right now? And as you start to get the answer to that, then notice what information did your brain suddenly pay attention to answer that question. Because when you ask yourself, where am I in my own resilient zone right now? And you start to get that answer, what your brain is doing is it's suddenly taking that flashlight and training it on your own nervous system. Because our nervous system and brain, I mean, actually our brain's part of the nervous system. So our whole nervous system is talking to itself all day long. Information flow all day long. It's just happening back here where our brain is not paying attention to it consciously. So when you ask, how am I right now in my resilient zone? What is my energy level? How am I feeling on the inside? Your brain goes, well, make all that information conscious, please. And you're reading where your nervous system is right now. That is an act of mindfulness. That moment of saying, where am I? How do I know? What sensations am I paying attention to? That's being aware of your present moment experience. And hopefully you did that with a sense of kindness, right? Like, hey, how are you right now? As opposed to like sternness. Okay, so what happens when something stressful happens to our resilient zone, right? Something stressful happens, you log into a Zoom, you walk into a courtroom or administrative hearing to start a hearing. Well, the important thing to know about the resilient zone is that when you're in the zone, it's this band, but there are two zones outside the resilient zone, right? When you are not feeling as capable of meeting the moment and any stresses and challenges it might hold. And those are the high zone and the low zone. So not in your resilient zone, outside your resilient zone. So let's say you've been going along in your regular day, up and down, kind of in that gentle cadence. There's a little stress, a little calm, a little stress, a little calm, but you're still navigating. Something big happens that sets you off and you lose that cadence. And instead what happens is your nervous system does something like this. It kind of ricochets around and then it gets bumped out of your resilient zone. Now, when you get bumped up out of your resilient zone, this is hyper arousal in the nervous system. This is your fight, flight, freeze response, stress response, which we'll talk about more in a moment. And I know for me that when I get bumped out of my resilient zone high, I'm like anxious, worried. I can get really irritable. I can, if it gets really bad, I lash out at my friends and family, not a behavior I'm proud of. That's how I know that my energy is, high and outside my resilient zone. I'm not navigating from a place of intentionality. Same thing if I get bumped out low, below my resilient zone, the way that shows up for me is really that feeling like my battery is on empty, like that I'm slogging. And when things feel a little bit grayed out, almost like I'm sort of unplugged from my own life. And this is hypoarousal, right? This is when your nervous system is just sort of flattened out. Now, listen, all of us get bumped out of our resilient zone all the time. That's totally normal. We can't stop it, actually. We can't prevent it. The system has sort of these outlets where we go when things are really stressful. The place to start getting, noticing and maybe having some concern is when we get stuck, because our system is set to reset itself, right? That's part of being a mammal. Mammal systems get stressed and the nervous system then resets. The thing about being a human is we're not actually as good at resetting as all the other mammals, because we hang on to things and our brains don't support us in doing this. And so if we get stuck high or stuck low, we get stuck outside of our resilient zone. Our nervous system cannot reset, either because of what's coming at us and it's so intense, or because our brain is keeping us stuck out. That's where you start getting negative kinds of stress, burnout, and even trauma. So what do we do about that? Well, the goal here is to, over time, widen our resilient zone so that it's capable of handling greater stress. Right? Like if I start lifting weights and my biceps get stronger, I can lift heavier weights. If I do practices that expand my resilient zone, I can navigate greater stresses still within my zone, and that sense of being able to navigate intentionally. So how do we achieve that? How do we widen our resilient zone over time? We do mindfulness practices. Like they go together like this. Okay, so a little bit more about the stress response system. And I know folks probably know this. So if it's review, maybe just hang in there with me and see if there are things that are a slightly different take or a new way of thinking about things. Okay, so the first thing to know about the human mind is that we have this intense negativity bias. It comes out of evolution. It was the brain's way of keeping us safe. And so the brain is like Velcro for anything bad that happens, because it's like the brain is like, oh, that was bad and stressful and dangerous and risky. I better hang on to it because I need to remember this to keep this human being safe. It also means that we're like nonstick pans for anything positive. The brain's like, yeah, okay, let that move on. That was great in the moment, but I don't need to remember that or really absorb it because it's not about keeping me safe. So we have to counteract as much as we can our own negativity bias. And of course, the more negative our brain is about things, the more it registers with stress and worry. So we're set up in the nervous system with sort of two parts of the autonomic, meaning that it's running automatically nervous system. We don't think about this most of the time. And this is related to the resilient zone, that up and down in the resilient zone. The sympathetic nervous system is the thing that registers alarm, stress, and prepares the body to react, to respond to some kind of stressful moment or challenge. You can think about it like the accelerator pedal in a car. The parasympathetic part of the nervous system is actually about the reset after something. It's called rest and digest because it starts to tell the body that it can slow back down and start doing non-emergency things like digesting our food. And it's like the break, right? And so these two parts of the nervous system are supposed to work together. Something stressful happens to us and we react in a way that is supposed to keep us safe. And when that stress has gone, then the parasympathetic system kicks up, puts the brake on, and resets our nervous system. And so if you think about this in terms of the resilient zone, it is that up and down. The sympathetic is the charge, our energy goes up, and the parasympathetic is the discharge. It lets that stress out of the nervous system. Like if you think about a dog, my dog does this, my poor dog, he's so scared of other dogs. When we walk around the neighborhood, there is one dog in particular that's always on the other side of a fence. You can't see this dog, but he's very scared of this dog. I can see as we start to get close to that fence, his nervous system picks up. Sympathetic nervous system goes, I know there's the dog on the other side of that fence. And he wants to run. He wants to run past that part of the block, right? Fight, flight, get out of here. But then as soon as we're past the fence, he pauses and he shakes his entire body, he just shakes everything off. That's his parasympathetic nervous system discharging the stress. We don't do that very well as humans, right? Like we have a stressful meeting or a stressful interaction with a client, and our nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system, kicks up, we don't then get off the phone or walk out of the courtroom and shake everything off. Instead, what happens is our brain takes us back in time and reviews the entire thing over again, keeping our sympathetic nervous system kicked up. We would actually do much better as humans if we could walk out of something stressful and literally shake it off and discharge that from the nervous system. So in the resilient zone, when we're high out of the zone or low out of the zone, what's happening is that the autonomic nervous system, this automatic thing, is out of whack. So if we're in the high zone, our accelerator is like pushed all the way to the floor. Fight, flight, freeze, right? Way up there. And if we're flattened out in the low zone, our brake is pushed on too hard and it's like not balanced, and we're just unplugged from life because the brake is past where it should be. So up and down in the nervous system. The impact on the brain, and I think this really matters for lawyer, having been a lawyer, there's a part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. And if you think about the mind being like this, like your wrist, and this is the back of the head, like this is where the brain stem is, like all these like older evolutionary parts of the brain. The emotional system is where the thumb is. It's sort of in the middle here. And this is our forehead, like right here. This part of the brain is called the prefrontal cortex. It's often called the logic center of the brain. And it is responsible for complex thinking, sort of strategy, regulating our emotions, decision-making, executive function, problem solving, everything that lawyers do, right? Sort of sits right here all day long. We're putting a lot of burden on this part of the brain. And it actually is like a battery. It spends down through the day, and it actually takes a ton of energy for the brain and the body to run that part of the brain. Now, the intersection between the stress response, which actually happens here in the more emotional part of the brain, the limbic system, is that when the stress response kicks off and we are in that sort of sympathetic place, the brain only needs essential function: run away, fight something off, freeze, and try to not be noticed. And so what it does is it takes the prefrontal cortex offline. We literally flip our lid when we're stressed. But that's so hard as a lawyer, because the things that are stressful are often the moments where we need access to the prefrontal cortex the most. We're making an argument. We're interacting with a client who's having a hard time. We're doing a know your rights presentation, all stressful things for the nervous system, where we really want to have as much access to the prefrontal cortex as possible. So again, mindfulness is the thing where we go, oh, I'm stressed. I've flipped my lid. I need the prefrontal cortex back. How do I settle my nervous system down so I have access to the part of the brain that I actually need to do this lawyering thing right now? One last thing to note about the stress response system is that it doesn't matter whether the thing is happening or we're perceiving it. Meaning, I live in a part of California where there are mountain lions in the hills where I go hiking. And if I'm here, if I'm on the trail and I see a mountain lion, which knock on wood has never happened, right? Of course, the stress response system kicks off, right? Mountain lion in real life in front of me, fight, flight, freeze, do something. But if I'm sitting here in my office and my default mode network mind is wandering around and thinking about the hike I'm going to take later in the day, and my brain, as it daydreams, imagines meeting a lion on the trail, it sets off the exact same biological response in the sympathetic nervous system. Our brain, which is designed to think lots of things, does not make a difference in terms of stress response to the thing actually happening and imagining the thing or remembering the thing. So if you've had a tough court hearing and it's over and your brain goes back and reminds you of the tough thing and like replays the tape for you, for your stress system and your well-being, it's the same for your body as being in the courtroom as it actually happened. I mean, our mind is just not our friend in this situation. And you can think about the impact that your thinking, that your brain's thoughts have on your well-being by categorizing your thoughts. So you can categorize them in this chart. Thoughts can be positive, neutral, meaning they don't have any emotional tone, or negative. They can be about the past, about the present, and about the future, right? So you can think any thought that your brain is thinking will fit somewhere on this chart. And of course, in the default mode network, where we're wandering around in time and daydreaming, the brain kind of goes back and forth between the past and the future, and the past and the future. It might spend a little bit of time in the present, but mainly it's doing that past and future. Like the brain is actually time traveling around. And most of the time it's negative. It's worrying about the past. It's rehearsing something that you're worried about in the future. And there's this big research study out of Harvard showing that it makes us as humans very unhappy in the moment when our brain does this, even though it's all unconscious and it's happening in ways that we're not making it do. It's the default mode network, after all. We're not controlling it. It really negatively impacts our sense of well-being. It makes us unhappy when our brain does this. And so the goal of mindfulness, again, that training our attention to be present, neutrally or positively, kindly to ourselves in the moment where we are actually living. And so it's the awareness of noticing that our mind is doing this time travel thing and corralling it back to be right here, right now, which is where we can then make choices, reset our nervous system, and navigate not from a place of worry and stress, but from present mindfulness. Okay, I said that. So we are now going to do some mindfulness practices to try on these concepts. And the first thing I have to say is that this is invitational, right? You can do this at any level or amount or approach that feels good to you. And so I would say that is the most important thing, is that if what you do in this moment is just listen to the guidance and think about how it might make you feel to do that, or you experiment and try it out and realize it's not comfortable or doesn't feel supportive, that's the meta thing, right? You're being mindful in that moment, right? You're paying attention to your own experience in the moment that we're trying this out together, and you're tracking your own nervous system, and you're navigating based on what is most supportive to you. That's actually mindful. So if you don't do the practice to get mindful, but you use a reaction to the practice to get mindful, it's all a win. Okay, so when we think about teaching or structuring mindfulness, and actually let me pause here for a moment and say this. Sometimes people think that mindfulness is a thing they need to learn how to do, like it's outside of yourself, like a foreign language almost, and you need to learn to do it in order to be able to do it. But mindfulness is actually the opposite, because just like our biology is already set up with this autonomic nervous system and these stress responses, our biology also already contains mindfulness. So rather than mindfulness being something that you learn how to do, mindfulness is an organic capability that already lives inside of you. So your version of mindfulness is also already in your own nervous system. So rather than being an outside thing that you have to go get, it is an inside thing that you just need to tap inside yourself. It's a resource that's already yours. You just have to find it, and occasionally find it on purpose. So these practices that I'm going to introduce are doors into this capacity that's already inside of you. And so if none of these work for you, that just means you need to find your unique door. There is no wrong door to finding and using that mindful space that already exists in your own nervous system. It's already biologically your inheritance. Okay, so if we think about some doors or some ways to structure about how people learn to find that mindfulness as a resource inside themselves, there's basically 4. I'm going to just briefly describe them, and then we're going to try out, really try out 2 versions of them. So the first is micro practices. And this is just sort of arbitrarily defined as anything that takes between sort of 30 seconds and 2 or 3 minutes. So these are like short little bursts of mindfulness during the day. It's like me lifting my 3-pound weights, right? I don't really feel it when I'm doing it. And so if I want to grow my muscles by lifting 3-pound weights, I'm going to need to do it in little bursts many times every day. So micro practices. And there's been some really cool research that's just been coming out, looking at control groups and groups that are doing micro practices. And they're getting really honed in on when micro practices actually have the most benefit for the brain and for the sense of well-being. And it's very clear that micro practices, these short little bursts, have the same positive effect as the longer, like 30-minute meditation practices. So that's micro practices. We're going to do some in a minute. Informal practices are like micro practices in that you do them throughout the day. But basically what you do is they're informal because you just pick something in life that you already do. It's not separate from things that you already do in life. And you use it as an anchor for your attention flashlight. And so I'll go a little bit more into what that can look like. Formal meditation practices I've covered, and they're the longer, they're like doing a 45-minute class where you sit and train your attention. We're going to try a little bit of one out today. And then workplace integrated practices are a thing that's actually developing more and more, where workplaces build mindfulness into their daily routines. So if you open a meeting with a transition moment that just allows everyone to kind of settle in, like we opened up today's training with, you can open up work meetings with a transition moment. It's important to keep it neutral so that people have choice to do what actually supports them. It's not dictated by the organization, but it's a moment of choice. Do whatever it is that allows you to really arrive here right now and kind of settle in. That is a workplace integrated practice. There's some really cool work that's happening around how do you have performance conversations in a mindfulness structure to make them more compassionate experiences, both for the people who are giving and receiving feedback. Okay, so four doors in to this thing of mindfulness. So first, informal practices. Like I said, this is choosing some kind of daily life activity and then using it to anchor your attention. So for example, when I brush my teeth in the morning, that's one of my informal practices. I could brush my teeth on autopilot, right? And let my default mode network wander around in time and stress me out about what's on my to-do list and the thing I forgot to do yesterday and that uncomfortable conversation I had with my kid and like all these things. Right? That's not mindful. Or I can pay attention to the act of brushing my teeth in all the ways in order to stay present. So it's doing the thing that I'm doing consciously. What does it feel like to brush my teeth? What does it sound like to brush my teeth? What is it like to move my body in the ways that are required to brush my teeth? And I'm using the act of brushing my teeth to be present in my own experience and with a kind of curiosity. What's it like to do this? Right? So that I'm anchoring in the present moment. I'm putting my mind in the active task network on purpose by using something that I do in my daily life already. Lots of folks do mindful walking. So if you're in an office or heading into a meeting or heading into a courtroom, you could use the act of walking, the physical behavior of walking, by getting really curious about all the sensations in the feet, in the ankles, in the knees, in the hips. What do you hear as you're walking? For like 4 minutes, right? And it's a way of bringing your attention into the present moment with curiosity about your own experience. So an invitation here is that you might start thinking about like, okay, if that were something that you wanted to try out, to tap your own mindfulness, what daily activity might be the right match for you. Okay, micro practices, again, are 30 seconds to 2 or 3 minutes. I'm going to offer you 3 of them right now. There are other ones listed in the resource materials. And again, invitational. Try these out. Don't listen, do it. There is no wrong way to do this now. So the first, and actually I'm going to check my time right now. Make sure, yes, right on, great. And just as a reminder, from the biology standpoint, what we're doing is we're taking our brain and telling it to be in active task network on purpose. We're keeping the brain out of the default mode network where it wanders around and thinks about us and thinks negative things about us on purpose. So one is a 5-sense check-in. And so you're using the senses to be in active task network. So if you use that flashlight analogy, you're taking the attention of your mind as a flashlight and training it on purpose to pay attention to the things that are present in your 5 senses. So the invitation, and if you want to do this with me, you can, is to pick one thing around you that you see right now and note it to yourself, because you're telling the brain, pay attention to this. So I can see right now a bird feeder out my window. I'm telling my brain to pay attention to the bird feeder that's right here, right now in the present moment. And you then one thing that you can hear, and maybe it's my voice, and then you might get curious about the pitch and the cadence and the volume of listening to the sound of my voice, which is telling your mind to be right here, right now in active task network and not wandering around. And then take one thing that you can feel, and maybe it's the thing you're sitting on, or if you're standing, your feet, or you can take your hands and put them on something near you. And then again, getting curious around what are all the sensations inside yourself from feeling something: temperature, texture, hard, soft, anything there is to absorb in the sense of feeling. And then paying attention to something you can taste, or if there's nothing to taste, something that you like to taste, right? Bringing that to mind. You can see what that did to my face. I felt that actually. I thought about ice cream. Something that you like to taste, which is telling your mind, be here right now. And then something that you can smell, or if there's nothing to smell around you, something that you like to smell. And again, we just quickly went through each of the senses and used them to anchor our attention in this moment with some curiosity, using the body to get out of the thinking default mode network, daydreaming mind, and get here right now. What that does is it resets your nervous system. It gives your nervous system a moment to just get back into the resilient zone if you were up or out. Okay, next one, and this is actually used a lot in the medical field. For doctors, I think it translates really well for lawyers, because like doctors, we often go from thing to thing to thing to thing to thing with stress points in each of them. I can feel that inside myself even as I talk about it, right? You go from meeting to meeting, or client appointment to client appointment, or argument to argument. And that can build up in the nervous system over the day because we don't, like my dog, shake things off. So we have accumulated stress through the day as we go from thing to thing. So the idea is this. It's called 2 feet and a breath. You check in with both feet. You take a breath as a pause for your nervous system in between things. And before I lead us through this, let me just say this. From a trauma-informed stance, breathing mindfully has been shown for some folks that are holding trauma, because trauma is a biological function. If you're holding trauma in your body, which is where trauma lodges over time in our lives, for some folks, breathing mindfully can unintentionally set the nervous system off, or can be an inadvertent trigger for trauma. So I say this just because if you notice that the breathing part is not comfortable for you or not supportive for you, that's, first of all, that's a great job. You're reading your nervous system. And second of all, don't do it. That's a moment for choice. And you can just do the feet, or you can do 2 feet and sound, right? If that's a more comfortable prompt. Okay, so if you want to try this one out, the idea is you've come from something maybe stressful, you're a little higher in your resilient zone, or you're blown out or up, like you realizing you're not navigating, you have to walk into the next thing. What you do is you just take your mind, get it out, take the attention of your mind, get it out of the busy brain, and tell it to drop all the way to your feet. Pay attention to the sensations that are in your feet, which are always there. It's just the brain tunes them out most of the time. If it helps them bring online, you can wiggle your toes a little bit, or you can even rock from side to side, or go up on your toes and then up on your heels, or you can stand on one foot and then the other, and notice what happens when you shift your weight like that. So pay attention to 2 feet. And when you're firmly paying attention to your 2 feet, take an inhale and an exhale. You have just reset your nervous system by being in active task mode network on purpose. And then you can enter into the next thing in your day. So micro practice, reset and stabilize the nervous system. And the last one that we'll do, now this is an only breathing one, and it includes holding and releasing your breath. So if the breath didn't feel comfortable for you, you can just listen to this one and imagine it, or you can actually do it with you can do it by moving your hands instead of breathing, or moving your feet instead of breathing, and paying attention to those sensations. I'll guide it right now in terms of with breathing, but that's completely optional. And the idea is that, and actually the military does this quite a bit as one of their mindfulness practices, even when they're out in combat. I say that just because it's got some data behind it. I sometimes think that the stress of lawyering is not so dissimilar for our nervous systems in being in those high intensity moments. So this can be an immediate micro practice that if it's supportive to you. And the idea is that you breathe in for 4 counts. You hold your breath for 4 counts. You breathe out for 4 counts, and then you hold the breath out for 4 counts. So breathing, holding it in, breathing out, holding it out. And I'll count it out for us. And we'll just do this twice together. And again, if it's not supportive to you, don't do it. So you breathe in, 2, 3, 4, and hold, 2, 3, 4, breathe out, 2, 3, 4, hold out, 2, 3, 4, breathe in, 2, 3, 4, and hold, 2, 3, 4, exhale, 2, 3, 4, hold out, 2, 3, 4, and then returning just to a regular breath. And just checking in and seeing like what sensations are there now on the inside, a little check-in with your nervous system. And are those sensations, on the pleasant side, on the unpleasant side, which is great noticing, or are they just neutral? They're neither one. Great. Thank you for doing or practicing those micro practices together. So again, just a reminder of the biology behind this, right? We are moving intentionally into the active task network, right? Stopping the mind from daydreaming and wandering. And because our thoughts can be overwhelming to our own system, right? The brain is very good at thinking, but not always good at not always thinking in ways that are good for us. And so we use the body as the anchor, right? If you think about all of those micro practices, we were using the body as the anchor because the body isn't doing all of that thinking that can be so stressful. The other thing is the body, unlike the mind, doesn't time travel, right? The mind can think about the past and can think about the future, but our body is just loyally, sort of dutifully moving through each moment where we're alive. It doesn't do default mode wandering. The body's always here right now. That's all it does. It's breathing, it's digesting, it's present, it's got sensations. So the body can be a kind of reliable, trustworthy comfort zone for us. Now, of course, there's also moments where the body has pain, and that takes a different kind of mindfulness. But the body is here right now. And so if we get curious about what's going on in the body, it gives our brain a break from those overwhelming thoughts. Okay. And now we're going to do a 10-minute mindfulness meditation practice. So a slightly longer practice. We're outside of the micro practice area. I'm going to offer some guidance just to give you a high-level preview before we get into it, is that we're going to anchor our attention, right, the flashlight, on a series of touch points in the body, right, using the body to put the brain in active task network and calm down the flow of thoughts, using first the feet, and then the seat or hips, and then our hands, and then sounds around us. Now, the invitation is to try out as much or as little of this as you want. I'll offer some guidance throughout, but I'll also offer some moments of silence where you can work with your brain on your own. Now, going back to the thing, mindfulness is not getting the brain to stop doing its thing. That's not possible. It's designed to do this thinking thing. We need it to do that. And so the brain will, no matter what you do, flip over into default mode network. It does that all day long without us noticing it, so that nothing's going to change just because we're meditating in this moment. And so the thing to do is, when you notice that your brain has started wandering, because it's going to over and over again, not to get contracted or alarmed or worried or stressed by that fact. It's just to notice it. And that moment of noticing that your brain has done this thing, that's mindfulness. Like you're doing it in that moment. And so I sometimes think about my mind like a kind of puppy, like who's curious about lots of things in the world, but will also wander around when its attention gets fixed. And so I try to talk to myself in those moments the way I would talk to a puppy, like not yelling and screaming and disciplining it, but by sort of being like, oh, that's so cute. You did that thing. Come back over here now, right? Trying to apply that same inner kindness or warmth to my mind, because it's just doing the thing that evolution designed it to do. It's just that it's not always so great for my well-being when it does it. Okay. So moving into practice. Let me just look at my notes and see if there's anything else, right? So this is called a focused attention or anchored attention meditation. And it's just to try out and strengthen our ability to focus on purpose on something in the present moment. Okay, yep, I'm going to set a timer so I don't lose track of time in the middle of this. And for transparency, I've got some notes that I'm going to look at so that I remember how I wanted to guide this. Okay, so starting by finding a comfortable position for your body. And you can do this standing or sitting or even lying down, whatever it is that's most comfortable for you. You want the body to kind of be upright or elongated if you're lying down, but not stiff, not rigid. So it's kind of like you've got a sense of dignity and relaxation at the same time. That's what you're looking for. And then in order to make it easier for the brain to pay attention, you can close your eyes if that feels supportive for you. It's not always comfortable for everyone. So if closing your eyes is not the right match for you, you can lower your eyelids sort of 3/4 of the way, or you can just look down at the ground with a soft, diffused gaze. What you're trying to do is give the brain less points of visual stimulation and kind of just tone the volume down of visual in the visual field. So doing whatever is most comfortable for you, upright, comfortable position, eyes closed or lowered. And starting just by bringing your attention to what it feels like in your body, just to be here right now. just noticing, almost like you could be a radar dish to your own body's sensations. Just noticing and kind of being a little curious about whatever's here right now in the body, using the body as that anchor. And there will be neutral sensations, and there will be pleasant sensations, and there will almost certainly be unpleasant sensations. And just noticing everything that's there. And then directing your attention, so it's training that flashlight of awareness all the way down to your feet. And where they're coming into contact with the floor or any other surface or thing that they're in contact with. And exploring with your mind and some curiosity, what are all the sensations that you can experience in the area of your feet? Is there temperature? Are they warm or cold or neutral? Are they touching anything like socks or shoes or the ground or anything else? Can you bring your toes online? Sometimes I have to wiggle mine. And for some folks, there might not be sensations in the feet, or there might not be a foot or feet. And if that's the case, just noticing that as well. Using anything in the general area of the feet to keep the mind's attention in this moment experience right now. And again, if you notice the mind has wandered away from the feet, which it is going to do, it's supposed to do that, just noticing that has happened. And then just kindly and gently drawing the mind back and telling it to pay attention to the feet. And now training your attention up to the area of the hips and the seat, or maybe the lower back, wherever you feel sensations, either from lying or standing or sitting on something. And again, just asking yourself, what are all of the sensations in that area of the body that are present right now that you can tell the mind to pay attention to keep the mind anchored in this moment where we are right now? Is there pressure anywhere? Can you feel any clothing on the skin anywhere? Is there a sense of being supported or grounded where it comes into contact with the surface? Any sensations at all in that area of the body where your brain can be curious and pay attention. And shifting your attention now to the anchor of the hands and noticing what sensations might be present in the hand, if those are available to you. How are they positioned? Is there any kind of sensation of being on something or supported by something? Are they straight or curved? Is there any tension or relaxation? Any sensations at all that are present in the hands. And again, when the mind wanders away, because it will tiptoe off and want to pay attention to something else, just noticing that it's happened, kindly and gently drawing it back to paying attention to sensations in the hands. And now the last anchor that we'll use to focus our attention is the sense of sounds, of hearing and the sounds around you. And just getting curious about what can you hear where you are right now. And maybe it's my voice, again, the pitch or tone, the volume, the cadence, or maybe the silence in between my voice. What sounds are closest to you? And what sounds might be farther away from where you are? Just noticing what's there and using sounds to keep the mind anchored and focused on your experience right now, right here. And now in our last moments, a little bit of choice, returning to whichever anchor was most supportive for you or that you're most curious about. You might go back to the feet or the seat or the hands or stay with sound, or maybe try something else totally different, whatever feels most supportive of you right now. And we'll just be in silence for a bit as you work with paying attention to that thing that anchors your attention. And when the mind wanders off, which mine just did, just knowing that that is a moment of mindfulness, the moment of moving from autopilot to awareness, and just bring it back gently, kindly to whatever it is that you're paying attention to. And as we start to transition out of this practice, first coming back to the awareness of being a whole body, your entire physical self, sitting here right now, just taking all of that in first, start coming back to yourself. And then you might like wiggle your fingers and toes, get back in the body. You can blink your eyes open or lift your gaze, wherever your eyes were. Sometimes it's useful to look around where the room where you are and kind of ground yourself again physically to the space that you're in. And just a moment of noticing that you took some time for yourself and for your nervous system to work at being here in the present moment, which is the only moment where we're actually living. And that you gave that to yourself, whatever that experience was, the pleasant or unpleasant or neutral aspects of it. You gave yourself about 10 minutes of practicing finding your own inside, organic, totally yours version of mindfulness. So thank you so much for your practice. Moving into closing out today, an invitation using the Resilient Zone framework to just, again, do that slight reading of your own nervous system. Where are you in your own resilient zone right now? And again, the second question always being, how do you know? If you get a sense of, how your energy level is in this moment, what has your brain suddenly paid attention to? The information that exists in your own system to know where you are. And to know that when you're doing that, you are actively reading your own nervous system, which is an underlying skill for mindfulness. Okay, closing out, a recap of what we covered. A bit about mindfulness, what it is, right? Paying attention in the present moment experience with a kind of kindness to ourselves and curiosity about what's happening inside of us. And what it's not, which is blissful nirvana state or telling our brains to stop doing the thing that it was designed to do, right? White knuckling it into calm doesn't work. And its connection to well-being, right? How is it that being mindful in this present moment, in telling our minds to train its attention on our own experience, is connected to well-being, even when our own experience in the moment is stressful and challenging. Even when we tune in and there is challenge, it is better to be mindful. It is better for our well-being to be mindful than to be in that place where the brain accelerates or amplifies our stress response. We did some work around the neurobiology of our own stress response systems and what we do as mammals and what we do as humans that can keep us blown out of our resilient zone in that hyper or hypo arousal. And then we tried out some different mindfulness practices, thinking about an informal practice. What is it like to take an active daily living and make it an anchor for our awareness? We did 3 micro practices that are short little bursts of mindfulness that you can do on purpose throughout the day. And then we tried out a 10-minute focused attention mindfulness meditation practice, which is training the brain to pay attention for longer periods of time. Okay, so an invitation to you then is to think about what might be one action item that you would do today coming out of this, and maybe connecting it to your own well-being, something that you're curious about, that you want to play around with, that you want to experiment with, that felt particularly supportive or useful to you. And I'm going to pause for like 30 seconds or so and just give you a moment to really identify one viable action item. Because we know that human learners, adult learners, do much better moving from a training experience into actual use of the content if they identify one thing that they will try out and do next. So I'll just hold here for a moment to each of you. You can jot it down or just, think about it concretely to yourself. From a coaching mindset, I might ask you, what's one commitment that you would make to yourself and your own well-being that might come out of any part of the experience today? So I'll set a timer for 30 seconds so that I actually stop talking. Great. Hopefully that gave you enough time to land on one action item that would be resourcing to you out of today. Couple of things as we sort of back out of the experience. I believe Jorge has already put in the chat, or he will. There's a bunch of additional resources that I pulled together, some of which are specific to mindful lawyering. Folks in the legal profession who are thinking about mindfulness and the role that it plays in lawyering, and specifically how to support lawyers in using mindfulness as a core element of the practice, not as a side thing that we do, but that is actually considered a core competency for lawyers. And then just some other folks in the mindfulness world that I think are particularly great, or who have been teachers of mine, and directing you, including places where you can find additional guided meditation practices for longer period of time that are for longer periods, or short micro practices that are guided as well. I would ask for your mindfully frank and honest feedback in the evaluation survey. I am currently in a 2-year formal mindfulness teacher training program because it was one of my goals, sense of purpose in my life, to try to bring the benefits of mindfulness more deeply into the legal aid community. And so as part of that, I would just be so grateful and appreciative for your very honest feedback about how this landed with you, what worked, what didn't, equally important, because it will so help me hone what I'm trying to do as I go through this mindfulness teacher training program. So I would just be very, very grateful. And then I think we have a little bit of time. Yeah, that's a thank you from me, but a little bit of time if any questions came up, or there's any places where folks would want a little bit more information. And I can probably stop sharing and see, let's see if I can make that happen.
Well, thank you, Julia. I don't see questions here on the chat. If anybody wants to come off mute, raise your hand, share, feel free to do so. In the meantime, I have been dropping a lot of links in the chat as well. That includes information about the CLE code, which I'm about to read out loud just in case if anybody wants to write it down. And but yeah, I will send out an email through Zoom within 24 hours. It's going to include a shared folder with the materials that Julia used today, the slides and other resources that she has shared. I also dropped in the chat information about Julia. We do have Julia coming to us again in a few weeks, so I did drop the registration link as well. I still don't see any questions or anybody raising their hand, so well, Julia, thank you for this insightful presentation, and thank you all for being here today and attending today's webinar. We hope you found the session valuable and that it provided useful takeaways for your work. I know it's definitely, I mean, as I was listening in, there's a lot of practices that I want to try to incorporate. I still don't know which one is the best for me, but I'll definitely be trying them all. And before I conclude again, I just wanted to remind everybody that I'll be sending out all these materials. It's really soon that we'll be sending out the email. If for whatever reason you don't get them, you have my email. Track me down and I'll make sure I get all these materials and recordings to you. So if you do have any follow-up questions or you need further information, I know Julia said he was okay with contacting her. That's why I shared her contact information in the chat as well. If for whatever reason you cannot get a hold of Julia, just come to me and I'll make sure I connect both of you. And we'd love to hear your feedback. That's where I had that survey that Julia mentioned. I dropped the survey link in the chat as well. It will also be included in the email. So, Julia, I wanted to thank you again for sharing your expertise with us and for all of you to participating. We look forward to seeing you in future events. We're actually going to be seeing you in 2 weeks again. So I'll be dropping that registration link in there. Do you want to give us a preview, Julia, of no spoilers though, of that next webinar? You know, what are we looking at?
Yeah, that the next webinar is all about taking a coaching mindset into our work, particularly in managing other people, supervision relationships, and what does it look like to take a coaching mindset, which has a lot to do with mindfulness. It's a super aware, compassionate, strengths-based approach. But I've been working with another person who's a former legal aid lawyer turned coach to make it super concrete. Like, here are the core competencies of a coaching mindset, and here's how they apply to supervising folks. So it'll be drilled in around that topic.
Awesome. And I'll plug again the ABA standards. It's only about 400 pages, but if you want to nerd out like I do all the time, definitely worth a read. And that you'll definitely understand why I'm such a big fan of Julia, because that's one of my go-tos. That's been one of my go-tos my entire career as a legal aid attorney. So if you have any supervisors that you think you would recommend this training to, make sure you have them register. We'll make sure to send that link over. And I think just coaching training, it still really helps, even whether you're a supervisor or not, just getting that other perspective. And sometimes we kind of have to coach our clients as well, so that could also provide us with another perspective. So I don't see any questions or hands raised, so I dropped the CLE information in the chat. I will be sending everything out via email, so thank you all again for participating. And Julia, thank you for being here today. Have a great rest of your day, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.